It was exactly 11:42 a.m. on January 27, 1945. Sergeant Robert Chen, a young man of only 22 years old, was sitting in the barber's chair of the Central Fire Control Station of the B-29 Superfortress, christened A-52. Outside, at 28,000 feet above the Pacific Ocean, the environment was hostile to human life. The outside thermometer read 45 degrees below zero, a cold so intense and penetrating that if a glove were removed for even a few seconds, the skin would be instantly burned by the ice stuck to the metal of the weapons. Inside the pressurized fuselage, the air was thin and tense. Oxygen condensed into ice crystals that spread across the plexiglass of Chen's observation cupola, forcing him to constantly wipe the visor with his flight jacket sleeve. The monotonous hum of the four Wright R-3350 radial engines was the only soundtrack, a constant vibration that saw into the crew's bones during the long hours of flight from the tropical base on Saipan. Chen was the youngest gunner in the 497th Bombardment Group, but the responsibility on his shoulders was disproportionate to his age. In his hands was control of the most advanced defensive system of World War II, the General Electric Fire Control System. Unlike early bombers, where men fired weapons manually, trembling with recoil, Chen operated a primitive analog computer. He looked through an optical sight and moved small handles. The computer calculated wind speed, gravity, and parallax, and automatically aimed 4 remote turrets scattered across the fuselage. He was, essentially, a sniper operating a deadly video game before video games existed. He had already flown 11 combat missions over the industrial heartland of Japan. He had only fired his weapons in anger twice, once in Nagoya and once on the coast, but had 0 confirmed kills. In his record, he was just another anonymous gunner. But what Chen didn't know as he gazed at the gray horizon was that the rules of the aerial game had drastically changed that morning. The mission of the day was to attack Tokyo's port and industrial facilities. But for the Japanese defenders, the situation had surpassed despair. By January 1945, the American 73rd Bombardment Wing had already lost 31 B-29s and 340 men. The Japanese had realized that trying to shoot down these flying monsters with machine gun fire was ineffective. The B-29's armor was too strong, and they flew too high. Therefore, the 47th Sentai Squadron, an elite unit based on the outskirts of Tokyo, had adopted a new and terrifying doctrine: the mathematics of despair. The Japanese pilots, at the controls of the fast Nakajima Ki-44 Tojo fighters, known to the Americans as the Demon Hunter, received implicit orders. They stopped seeing the fight as a duel. They began to see it as an exchange of chess pieces. A B-29 cost us $600,000 and carried 11 highly trained specialists. A Tojo fighter was cheap and carried only 1 man. The order was simple and chilling: if the ammunition runs out, or if the bomber doesn't fall, become the bullet. They were practicing deliberate ramming attacks, known as Waiter. These weren't traditional kamikaze pilots attacking ships. They were fighter pilots using their planes' propellers to saw off the wings and tails of American bombers. When A-52 crossed the Japanese coast at noon, the warning radar began to scream. It wasn't 2 or 3 planes, it was 43 interceptor fighters taking off to converge on the American formation. They climbed almost vertically, like rockets, driven by fanaticism and the defense of their homeland. Robert Chen adjusted his goggles, checked the circuits in his turrets, and took a deep breath of the cold oxygen from his mask. He was about to face more enemy planes in a single hour than most gunners had seen in the entire war. The sky was about to fill with burning aluminum. The first sign that hell had arrived appeared at noon sharp, breaking the monotony of the humming engines. On the intercom, the urgent voice of the tail gunner cut through the static silence. "Bandits, 6 o'clock high. They're rising fast." Sergeant Chen peered through his plexiglass cupola. What he saw didn't seem real. The first Japanese fighter appeared not as an airplane, but as a tiny black dot rising almost vertically through the cloud layers, 12,000 yards away. It was a Kai-44 Tojo, an interceptor designed specifically to hunt B-29s, fast, armored, and armed with 40mm cannons. The enemy pilot reversed flight at 27,000 feet, the sun gleaming on its silver wings, and initiated a suicidal dive directly onto the American formation. Chen didn't flinch. His hands, gloved and numb from the 45-degree cold, gripped the handles of the General Electric fire control system. It's crucial to understand what Chen was doing. He wasn't just aiming a gun. He was operating the most advanced computer of the time. As he rotated his optical sight, electrical sensors sent data to an analog brain in the fuselage. This computer instantly calculated wind speed, gravity, distance, and parallax. 5 meters away from Chen's seat, high in the fuselage, the machine gun turret came to life. The electric motors hummed, rotating the twin 50-caliber barrels to intercept the future threat, not where the plane was, but where he would be. The battle began with a sound the crew would later describe as tearing fabric. Chen pulled the trigger. He didn't feel the recoil of the guns. They were too far away. He only saw the result. A short, 3-second burst of tracer bullets drew a red line of fire across the blue sky. The geometry of death was perfect. The American bullets converged brutally against the Japanese radial engine. The Tojo shuddered violently, spewed oily black smoke, and began to disintegrate in midair. A wing detached, spinning like a dry leaf while the fuselage fell like a burning stone. First confirmed slaughter. But there was no time to celebrate, not even to exhale. The sky was suddenly filled with black dots. At 12:21, the situation went from dangerous to critical. The pilot's voice, calm but tense, announced, "Starting the race to the pump, doors open." For any bomber crew, this is the most terrifying phrase in the English language. It means that for the next 6 long minutes, the pilot must hand over control of the plane to the bombardier officer and his Norden sight. The B-29 has to fly straight, perfectly level, and at a constant speed. You can't turn, you can't dive, you can't evade. For 6 minutes, A-52 became a fixed target, suspended on invisible rails at 28,000 feet. They were ducks sitting at a fair, waiting to be shot. It was at this moment of absolute vulnerability that the Japanese attacked with full force. 14 fighter planes positioned themselves 3,000 feet above them, orbiting like a pack of sharks waiting for blood. They did not attack individually like lone samurai. They attacked in coordinated pairs, designed to saturate American defenses. They dove, crisscrossing the sky at mathematical angles designed to confuse the fire control computers. Chen, with almost supernatural concentration, ignored the primal fear of being on a fixed target. He focused on the leader of the first diving pair. Their turrets spewed fire again. At the same time, the gunners of other B-29s in the formation fired at the same point of convergence. The result was catastrophic for the enemy. The Japanese pilot's cockpit exploded under the impact of dozens of simultaneous 50-caliber bullets. The plane, now an uncontrolled metal projectile with a dead pilot at the controls, veered violently to the left. The unthinkable happened. The dead fighter collided mid-air with its own wingman. A bright, silent orange fireball bloomed amidst the enemy formation. Pieces of aluminum, glass, and steel rained down on the B-29 like deadly hail. In a matter of seconds, Chen had scored his 3rd and 4th kills indirectly through the chaos he had created. But the explosion and smoke provided cover for something far worse. Amid the falling wreckage, 2 surviving Japanese fighters managed to pierce the wall of lead. Chen saw them emerge from the black smoke. They were now less than 500 yards away, coming head-on. He could see the flashes of their 20mm cannons flickering on the edges of their wings, and unlike the others, these pilots showed no intention of deviating at the last second. They didn't correct course. They didn't try to flank. Chen realized with a shiver down his spine that they weren't there to shoot. They had become the bullet. The B-29 was stuck on its course, unable to move, while two one-ton manned missiles rapidly grew on the windshield, approaching at the combined speed of sound. Chen saw the flashes of the 40mm cannons flickering on the enemy's wings, but what chilled him wasn't the fire. It was the trajectory. The Japanese pilot hadn't attempted any classic evasive maneuvers. There was no tilting of the wings, no deviation. That man had committed himself, body and soul, to a ramming attack. A waiter time seemed to dilate, each second dragging on like an hour. Impact in 4 seconds. Chen kept his finger pressed against the trigger, refusing to close his eyes as death approached at a combined 900 km/h. His .50 caliber bullets hammered the fighter's cowl, creating bright sparks and tearing chunks of metal from the enemy plane's nose. He saw smoke, he saw flames, but the Tojo continued accelerating through its own wreckage, a duralumin comet determined to kill. At 100 yards, ballistics ceased to matter. It was now merely a matter of raw physics and brutality. At 12:22, the world inside A²52 turned upside down. The Ki-44 fighter violently collided with engine number 3 on the right wing. The sound was not that of a normal gunpowder explosion. The surviving crew would later describe that noise as a giant steel hammer hitting an empty boiler, a metallic, sharp and deafening sound of structures collapsing. The B-29 screamed. The Japanese fighter's propeller acted like an industrial circular saw, chewing through the armored fuselage and engine nacelle. The 40-ton bomber veered violently to the right, almost flipping over with the force of the impact, while its own number 3 propeller, 4 massive steel blades, was ripped from the wing as if made of paper, falling into the void in a spiral. The Japanese fighter disintegrated on impact, raining down a storm of aluminum, glass, and steel fragments on Chen's turrets. The entire plane shuddered with seismic violence. Chen was thrown against the walls of his gunnery station, his helmet slamming against the visor, while the alarms in the cockpit began to scream in unison, competing with the wind that now whistled through the holes in the fuselage. Red emergency lights exploded on the flight engineer's panel like a demonic Christmas tree. Fire in engine 3, critical vibration, loss of oil pressure in engine 4. The impact had severed vital fuel and oil lines. The commander had no choice under penalty of immediate explosion. He was forced to shut down and feather engine number 4 immediately, the only one remaining intact on the right side. The math was terrifying. In a single second, A²52 had lost 50% of its total power. Lift disappeared. The bomber, now heavy and unbalanced, began to fall, breaking away from the protective formation of the other B-29s, dropping at an alarming rate of 300 feet per minute. Now they were what all bomber pilots fear being, a straggler, a wounded animal left behind by the herd. Alone, damaged, slow, the perfect target. 3 new Japanese fighters, seeing the giant bleeding black smoke and oil, swooped down like vultures for the coup de grace. Chen, battling the G-force of the fall and with the hydraulic system failing due to damage, had to use sheer muscle power to rotate the turret. Sweat froze on his brow. He shot down the 5th fighter with a sustained 4-second burst that shattered the cockpit into 1,000 glittering pieces. Immediately afterward, without time to think or feel fear, he manually operated the lower rear turret and shot down the 6th fighter, soaring off its right wing and sending it into the ocean. But the nightmare was far from over. The enemy was relentless. A 3rd fighter, a Ki-44 piloted by a veteran who had already exhausted his cannon ammunition, lined up for a second ramming. This time coming from the left, targeting the remaining engines. Chen spun the turret in despair, the mechanism screaming in protest without lubrication. He fired. Tracer bullets hit the fuselage, tearing off metal panels, exposing the fighter's internal structure, but the Japanese pilot didn't flinch an inch. He was already dead, but the plane was still flying. 50 yards away, Chen realized it was going to happen again. He cowered. The second impact was, if possible, even more violent and visceral than the first. The fighter struck engine number 1 at the tip of the left wing. The explosion was muffled, but felt in the bones of every crew member. The giant propeller of the B-29 disintegrated into deadly fragments that acted like grenades. The main fuel tank of the left wing ruptured, spraying gallons of highly flammable aviation gasoline into the thin air. The fighter's fuselage split in two with the force of the impact. The tail section of the Japanese plane grazed by mere centimeters above the cockpit window of the B-29, so close that the American pilot said he saw the rivets, while the Japanese engine and cockpit smashed against the left wing, opening an irregular and gaping hole 2 meters in diameter. The sudden silence that followed was the most terrifying sound in the world. 2 direct collisions in less than 5 minutes. Engine 3 was gone. Engine 4 was dead and shut down. Engine 1 was destroyed and smoking. The A-52, a 32-ton technological marvel designed to cross oceans with 4 engines, was now crawling through the sky, falling like a brick, with only a single engine, number 2, running at full power, with the temperature gauges entering the red zone. The acrid smell of high-octane gasoline filled the cabin, mixed with the smell of electric ozone. The 45-degree cold poured freely through the holes in the fuselage. And on the horizon, through the tiers of cold and the smoke, Chen saw another wave of black spots forming. They weren't done with them yet. A Square 52 was no longer flying, it was falling. The altimeter was spinning backwards vertiginously, passing the 18,000-foot mark. The airspeed, which should have remained above 200 miles per hour to ensure lift, was bleeding to a dangerous 160. The metal giant was turning into a brick, and it was at this moment of total vulnerability that the radar warned. A third wave of Japanese fighters was lining up. They were 12 fresh interceptors, with full tanks and ammunition, coming to finish off the wounded beast. Inside the central firing station, Sergeant Robert Chen waged a silent and solitary battle, not only against the Japanese, but against the elements. With the fuselage riddled with holes, the heating system failed. The temperature inside his plexiglass bubble dropped to 62 degrees below zero. This isn't just cold, it's an alien environment. The moisture from Chen's breath instantly froze inside the mask, gluing the rubber to his facial skin. Tears of exertion turned into icy needles on his eyelashes. His hands, essential for operating the sensitive controls, were numb, moving only by muscle memory and sheer willpower. To make matters worse, the engine damage had affected the central electrical system. The brain of the fire control computer, which automatically calculated the targeting, began to malfunction. The hydraulic system, which moved the heavy turrets, lost pressure. Chen was no longer playing a video game. He was in a physical struggle. He had to drag the targeting reticle with the brute force of his shoulders, fighting against inertia and G-force while the plane shook violently. The 7th fighter dove. Chen, ignoring his burning muscles, anticipated the turn. His bullets ripped open the enemy's fuel tank. The fighter exploded in an instantaneous fireball. The 8th fighter made an arrogant mistake. The pilot, seeing the bomber smoking, flew straight ahead, believing the prey was dead. Chen punished the error with a 6-second burst. The fighter's engine stopped mid-air, and the plane fell silently into the clouds. But then, the most terrifying sound of aerial combat echoed through Chen's station. The click-empty metal feed chute. He glanced at the ammunition counters on the upper turret. 0 on the left. 0 on the right. No. Wait. The counter on the right showed a pathetic number. He had 15 .50 caliber bullets. The rate of fire of those weapons was 800 rounds per minute. This meant that he had less than a second remaining fire. The 10th Japanese fighter launched its attack. Any normal gunner would have panicked and fired too soon. But Chen waited. He saw the fighter grow closer in his sights. 1,000 yards. 800 yards. 600 yards. He could see the enemy pilot's leather helmet. At 500 yards, point-blank range in the sky, Chen pulled the trigger one last time. Rat-tat-tat. It was a surgical burst. All 15 bullets found their target. The 10th fighter jet disintegrated in mid-air. The turret was now dead, empty. But Chen refused to stop. He unbuckled his seatbelt and crawled through the narrow connecting tunnel toward the rear section of the plane. The bomber was swaying so violently that he was thrown against the icy metal walls several times. When he reached the belt section, he found chaos. The gunner in the right bubble was lying on the ground, severely wounded by shrapnel, his flight suit soaked in rapidly freezing blood. Chen didn't hesitate. He pulled his comrade aside and took his position. There were no computers, no gyroscopic sights, no remote turrets. They were old-school handheld machine guns. It was eye, muscle, and iron. When the 11th fighter tried to flank the plane on the blind side, Chen met it with a wall of handheld lead, shooting it down with a ferocity that only desperation creates. The final tally of that battle defies belief. When the smoke finally cleared, the crew of A-52 had shot down a confirmed total of 14 Japanese fighter jets in a single mission. The 14th kill was the most symbolic of all, proving that even enemy machines were exhausted. A Japanese pilot, seeing that bullets weren't bringing down the American giant, attempted a third suicidal ram attack. But he forced his own plane into the dive so hard that the fighter's engine exploded on its own before hitting the B-29. It fell into the sea without Chen needing to fire a single bullet. The remaining Japanese fighters, out of fuel, out of ammunition, and probably terrified by that flying fortress that refused to die, turned their backs and returned to Japan. The sky finally cleared and turned blue, but the silence that followed was worse than the noise. They had won the battle, yes, but now they were alone in a wrecked plane, losing altitude over the largest and deepest body of water on the planet. The real war for survival, the fight against the ocean and gravity, was only beginning. The silence that followed the battle was almost worse than the noise of the machine guns. The A-52 had survived 2 direct collisions and shot down 14 enemies, an absolute record. But now, the euphoria of survival had given way to a cold and cruel mathematical reality. They were alone over the vast Pacific Ocean. The damage report read by the flight engineer seemed like a death sentence. Engine number 1 was destroyed. Engine number 3 had been ripped from the wing. Engine number 4 was dead. The rudder was jammed. The left wing had a hole big enough to fit a car. And most terrifying of all, the distance to the base on Saipan was 1,512 miles. The estimated flight time with only one engine operating was 11 hours. The fuel in the punctured tanks was only enough for 9 hours. The crew took desperate measures. The commander ordered everything thrown overboard to lighten the load. Through the rear hatch, they threw the machine guns, the remaining ammunition boxes, the bulletproof vests, the parachutes, the maintenance tools, and even the heavy radios. The $60 million giant was stripped to the bone. They tried to restart engine number 4, knowing it was out of oil and would explode. It miraculously worked for exactly 28 minutes, giving them enough altitude to pass through a storm front before seizing violently and dying forever. But the real enemy now was the cold. Without electricity, the heating system died. The temperature in the cabin dropped to 40 degrees Celsius. In the back, the drama was human. The gunner in the right bubble and the bombardier were seriously wounded. The morphine syringes in the first aid kit had frozen solid and were useless. Chen, exhausted and frozen, removed the lining of his own heated flight suit and wrapped it around his comrades, trying to share the warmth of his own body. For hours, in the absolute darkness of the night over the sea, Chen held the wounded gunner's hand. At 8 p.m., somewhere over nothing, his friend's hand went cold and inert. He stopped breathing. There were no screams, no cinematic farewells, just a heavy silence. He died on the way home. At 10 p.m., the lights of Saipan Island appeared on the horizon like distant stars, but the fuel gauge read empty. The last engine, the Valiant number 2, began to cough and sputter, producing only vapors. 3 miles from the runway, at an altitude of 2,000 feet, the silence became total. The last engine died. The B-29, a 32-ton monster, had become the largest metal glider in the world. The pilot lowered the nose to maintain speed, pointing towards the darkness of the emergency runway. The right landing gear refused to deploy. They hit the ground at 110 miles per hour. It wasn't a landing, it was a controlled impact. The left wing gave way immediately. The metal screamed against the coral asphalt. Sparks lit up the tropical night like fireworks as the plane skidded, out of control, veering off the runway and tearing through the earth for 1,500 feet until it came to a stop in a cloud of dust and smoke. 10 men escaped alive through the wreckage of the tail section. The plane was declared a total loss. It would never fly again. A-52 had done the impossible. It flew 1,500 miles on one engine, survived 2 human missiles, shot down 14 fighter jets, and brought 10 sons of America back home. 2, sadly, made their last journey in that icy fuselage. The story of Robert Chen and his crew is more than a war tale. It's a testament to what humanity can endure when it refuses to give up. But time is cruel, and these stories risk fading into the silence of the archives. If the tenacity of these men moved you, I have a personal request. Smash that like button right now. Don't do it for the algorithm. Do it to ensure YouTube shows this story to more people. Let's prevent the sacrifice of A-52 from being forgotten. Subscribe to the channel and turn on notifications. Join our historical rescue battalion. And now I want to hear your voice. Go to the comments and tell me where you're watching from. Are you from the United States, Brazil, Portugal, Mozambique? Our community spans the globe. Tell us your location and if anyone in your family served in the armed forces. You're no longer just a spectator, you're now a keeper of this memory. Thank you for watching. Thank you for not forgetting. Rest in peace, Sergeant Chen. Mission accomplished.